Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 30th episode of the Diverse Minds podcast. And this week's episode is all about World Poetry Day. Saturday the 21st of March was World Poetry Day, which I think is especially important at the moment as poetry reaffirms our common humanity by revealing to us that individuals globally share the same questions and feelings that we all do. Poetry has and is the mainstay of oral traditions and over centuries communicates the innermost values of diverse cultures. In celebrating World Poetry Day, UNESCO recognises the unique ability of poetry to capture the creative spirit of the human mind. And 21st March was adopted as World Poetry Day in 1999 in Paris. And one of the main objectives of the day is to support linguistic diversity through a poetic expression and to offer endangered languages the opportunity to be heard within their communities. And the observance of World Poetry Day is also meant to encourage a return to the oral tradition of poetry recitals, spoken word, and the celebration of the spoken word. In addition to promoting the teaching of poetry, restoring a dialogue between poetry and the other arts such as theatre, dance, music, and painting, and to support small publishers to create an attractive image of poetry in the media. It's essential that poetry is not considered an outdated form of art, but one which enables society as a whole to regain and assert its identity, and to ensure that poetry is open for all. So in order to celebrate World Poetry Day, I am joined by the wonderful Jess Green. Jess Green is an award-winning performance poet and scriptwriter. She has performed at Glastonbury, Latitude and Bestival festivals and written 2 of her own shows, both published by Burning Eye Books, Burning Books in 2015 and A Self-Help Guide to Being in Love with Jeremy Corbyn in 2018, both of which I've seen and are excellent, and they both received 5 stars at the Edinburgh Fringe on their national tours. The theatre adaptation of Burning Books toured in 2018, including a performance at the NUT National Conference. Jess is also a BBC Slam champion and part of the BBC Writers Academy 2019 and 2020 and is writing for EastEnders, Holby City and Casualty. And we are super lucky to have Jess with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So let's kick off with a big question then, Jess. As it's World Poetry Day, I'd really love to know, as a poet and writer and former teacher, how poetry has enabled and shaped your leadership journey.
So I suppose, I started writing and performing poetry in Liverpool when I was in university about 10 years ago. And I just really fell in love with this idea of live storytelling in the back rooms of pubs. I just thought there was something really nice and quite sort of romantic about that. So I started performing poetry in very kind of informal and safe situations. And then I graduated and I'd sort of heard about people making a living from poetry, but never really thought about it. And then when I graduated, I was like, right, what am I going to do for a living? I had a degree in creative writing and I decided that I wanted to have a go at being a poet. So I came back home to Leicester. I said to my mum, that's what I'm going to do for a job. And I've made a living in kind of various different ways around that. So, I worked in a school library and I've done I do lots of workshops and then I perform lots. And I think it's interesting the way that I think my confidence in terms of my confidence in myself and my personality over the past 10 years has really changed and really grown. I think that I used to stand on stage 10 years ago and think, oh gosh, I'm terrible at this. I can't do it. I'm awful. And I wasn't very good at kind of hiding that. And then 10 years of kind of taking shows on tour and taking shows to the Edinburgh Fringe and performing in front of large audiences, I think I've become so much better at, I still go on stage and regularly think, oh gosh, I don't know if I can do this, but I've become so much better at hiding that. And I've become so much better at sort of faking confidence and faking that I'm completely comfortable and completely in control. And it's funny the way that you learn that if you can try to convince an audience of that, then after a while you begin to believe it yourself. And I think there's something quite interesting in that.
They do say, don't they, fake it till you become it, till you really truly become it and you believe that yourself.
They do, and I think, I think there is a lot of truth in that you are always your worst critic. And I think over the past couple of years particularly, I've been really thinking about that. And whenever I'm sort of beating myself up about something, and I think particularly at this time of when we're all self-isolating and we're just on our own with our own thoughts, it's that thing about just because you think something, it doesn't mean that it's true. And just because you think something about yourself, it doesn't mean that anybody else thinks it. And I think that's always worth bearing in mind.
Yeah, completely. And I so enjoyed both Burning Books and A Self-Help Guide to Being in Love with Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you.
Yeah, really loved them. And I think I saw the first performance, I think one of the first performances of Being in Love with Jeremy Corbyn, Self-Help Guide in Leicester. And so how did you come to write those? And Burning Books, I'm guessing, is from your experience of being a teacher. And then how about Self-Help Guide?
So Burning Books came from, so I should say, although having worked in a lot of schools doing workshops, I was never a teacher. I worked in a school library. Well, how did it all start? I come from a family of teachers. All my family are teachers. And then when I came back from university, I got this part-time job in a school library in the afternoons. And the way that I was living my life at that point was that I would get up in the morning and I would go and do a poetry workshop in a school or prison or probation hostel. And then in the afternoon, I'd go and do this part-time job in a school library. And then in the evening, I'd go and do a gig somewhere within 2 hours drive of Leicester, and then I'd normally get back about 1 o'clock in the morning, and then I'd sleep for a few hours, and then I'd get up and start it all over again. And I did that for months, and it was exhausting, but I did kind of, in that first bit of my career, make quite a leap in terms of people hearing my work. But working in this school and working in a lot of schools doing these workshops as well meant I sat in a lot of staff rooms and I spoke to a lot of teachers. And it was right when Michael Gove had just become Education Secretary and the landscape of education was changing dramatically. So I wrote this one poem called Dear Mr. Gove, which went online and it went viral. And then I just started writing a lot of poems about education. And then I turned those poems into a show. So I turned them into Burning Books. Burning Books went to the Edinburgh Fringe. It went on tour. And then it was funny, the more I performed it, the more I met teachers who it really resonated with. And actually, I finished the tour in 2015 and I thought, I don't feel like I'm really finished with the subject. In fact, having taught it, I'd learnt so much more about the ever-changing landscape of education. So then I got some Arts Council funding and I did a whole lot more research into teaching, and I adapted the show into a play of the same name, which was much more about whereas the poetry show was quite general, looking at kind of the national landscape of education, the play was about a specific group of teachers in a staff room in an inner city secondary school. So that went on tour in 2017 and it went to the NUT National Conference in Brighton. And then after that, I was looking at what it was that in 2017, my publisher got in touch with me. They had published the Burning Books poetry collection and they asked me whether I wanted to put another collection out. And I looked at the things that I was interested in writing about and the things that I had been writing about. And at the time, it was when Jeremy Corbyn had just been elected leader of the Labour Party, and the Labour Party was in this real state of flux and incredibly divided. And I was a lifelong Labour member. And so I just started writing about that and then created this show. And what was really interesting was that went to Edinburgh in 2018. And then in 2019, I toured it throughout last year. And it was funny, I started writing it when Jeremy Corbyn had just become Labour leader. And my final show was 3 days before the general election. So I feel it's just interesting how that show had real parallels with, I guess, Jeremy Corbyn's tenure as leader.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I love those photos I saw of you that he met you. He came to the show, didn't he? And you met him, and there's a really beautiful photo of him flicking through the script, the play script with you, or the book with you.
Yeah. It was really nice because I went to Edinburgh and somebody tweeted me on the first day that I was in Edinburgh and said, do you know that Jeremy Corbyn's actually going to be at the Edinburgh Fringe for one day in the final week of August? So I started as a bit of a joke. At the end of each show, I asked people to tweet him to let him know about the show. And every day, more and more and more people did, until I think he was just being inundated with tweets about this show. And then it was a few days, actually it was the day after I'd won the BBC Slam competition, and the next day I got a phone call from someone on his team and said, all right then, he'll come and meet you. So that was really nice.
Oh, that's brilliant. And what was he like? What was his reaction to the show?
Oh, he was lovely. He was really nice. He is exactly as people say he is. He's very calm and softly spoken and seems sort of genuinely interested in everybody that he meets, if not slightly baffled that there had been this entire Edinburgh show dedicated to him. But he was lovely.
Oh, bless him, slightly baffled. That's made me chuckle. So, what does, given the work that you do and your writing, what does World Poetry Day mean to you?
Well, I think it's really interesting to ask me that question at the moment. Normally I would say it's great because it's such a celebration of poetry and poets, and World Poetry Day and National Poetry Day are the busiest days for poets, and it is really strange living in the time that we are, that poets, along with so many other freelance artists, are some of the hardest hit by coronavirus, because all of our work involves being around people if we are performers and if we go and do workshops. And none of us are working at the moment. And I think there's something quite eerie about a World Poetry Day without any poets. But then I guess at the same time, there are also quite a lot of conversations happening online about, where do we turn in times like this? And there's lots of people saying, well, the place that we turn is to music and television and films and poetry, and finding escapism in those things that have always provided escapism for us. So I suppose perhaps it's a World Poetry Day like no other, but also it's remembering the importance of poetry like never before.
Yeah, and I'm sure you're aware that there's a lady, and I forget her name, who has her poetry ambulance, doesn't she? It's in Wales, I believe.
Yeah,
and she administers poems they talk to her about how they're feeling, and she gives them a poem, which to me is really powerful, because I don't think it's just about medication and just a medical model. So given the fact that we're not currently able to gather, how do you think poetry can help our mental well-being at this time?
I think what's been really interesting is that over the past 5 to 10 years, there has been a real rise in people buying poetry books and people going to poetry events. And that is particularly young people, which is surprising, because when you go into schools, it's often the poetry which is on the national curriculum which really puts young people off poetry. But I think the thing is that when we are living in times of crisis and chaos and the world feels like a very scary place, there is something about poetry which, if not providing answers, it crystallizes an idea. And I think there's something really nice about reading poets who lived 200, 300 years ago, who felt exactly the same as we do now. And there's something very special about reading a poem in a way that, and I'm a great reader and I love reading novels as well, but I think there's something very special about reading a poem and the crystallization of an idea, and the way that can reach across 200-300 years is really special.
I completely agree, and I think poetry has the ability to pull you out of solitude as well. And it, like you said, it crystallizes it. And often the beauty of poetry is that it's bite-sized and that you can gain so much from it. And because poems often tend to be shorter, that you can reread them easily and take different messages from them every time.
Yeah, oh gosh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think, so often poems get criticised for being too difficult. And, I find it very frustrating often in the national curriculum that people are always told they've got to understand a poem. And there's a suggestion there, well, then you can only access poetry if you are intelligent or if you're well read. And actually, I don't think it should be about understanding poems. It should be about a way that poetry makes you feel. And I think that is the beautiful thing with a lot of poetry, that every time you come back to it, depending on what you are bringing to it as well as the reader, it can make you feel something different every time. And I think that's really important.
Yes, and I also hear you about how poetry puts people off, because I remember doing World War One and World War Two poems. I'm not saying they're not important, but they're from a particular white soldiers or a white English poet's perspective, male poet's perspective on the World War, when of course there were 6 million Asian soldiers, Indian soldiers that died. And I never saw that on the curriculum, and I never heard that. And it's actually only in the last 5 years, especially with the 14 to 19 project, that I've been able to access things that I think would have reached out to me. And so, yes, I think context is also key, but I think spoken word really helps that, and it really breaks the stigma down, or breaks conceptions and misconceptions about what poetry is or isn't.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, coming back to the national curriculum, it is just shocking that growing up somewhere like Leicester and, sitting in a secondary school classroom in Leicester of like 30 kids and 2 of us are white, and yet almost everything on the curriculum is by a white man. I just think it's completely bonkers. And I think that did get a little bit better in the last few years of a Labour government, and then I think it got a lot worse under Michael Gove. I think that the national curriculum is so Victorian and archaic now, and I think, and again, maybe that is why young people, if they are not accessing poetry as much in the classroom, you're right, that is something that they can get from spoken word. Spoken word is immediate, and it is often very youthful. It's often exploring themes that are really important to young people in a way that other art doesn't, in such an immediate way.
It's really lovely hearing you say that. Not lovely that the curriculum was the way it was, but lovely that, as someone who identifies as white, you felt it wasn't fit for purpose for an inner city school, that you felt it wasn't the right context. And thinking about Gove, I mean, I went to see the play of Trojan Horse and I didn't know any of it, but that shutting down and that kind of undermining of Asian teachers and what I think was an unfair investigation, because there were teachers talking about their experience, their lived experience, teachers who had been through it, to me just shone a light on the fact of shutting down. And like you said about Victoriana, the fact noughts and crosses isn't on the syllabus anymore, on the curriculum anymore. But I don't, but the hopefulness, and talking to you makes me feel like this, is that, young people are seeing through it and they're finding means and ways to do things differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, it's madness when you go into classrooms and you have kids in there who have just escaped war zones themselves and are, learning English is not necessarily their first priority, and yet they are presented with this war poetry, which just feels horrendous to be presenting kids who have just escaped war zones with here's some war poetry, and then they are marked in the same way as kids who have grown up surrounded by poetry and being taken to the theatre and having money thrown at them. I mean, it's just madness. But I think it's why it's really nice that we live in a time now of social media and YouTube and the internet, that kids can make their own work and can share that amongst themselves, and can share that with a wider audience, and to make them feel that they have a voice and what they have to say is really important. In a way that, that stuff didn't exist when I was at school. I mean, I remember when I was at university, I went to go and see a night of performance poetry, and had some sort of life-changing experience, because I'd never seen performance poetry before. I had no idea that poetry could be so immediate and so enthralling.
Yeah, I hear you. And I remember going to performance poetry nights at university and always wishing I could stand up there and do it, but I wasn't brave enough. Maybe one day, maybe this will push me out my comfort zone.
Absolutely.
And then switching the focus to workplaces, because that's, most of the people I work with are in workplaces. How can workplaces use poetry to help staff be more creative and support their mental health?
Gosh, that's really interesting. It's really interesting as well, because I haven't been in a workplace for about 10 years. I haven't had a proper job for about 10 years. I've been self-employed the entire time. Gosh, how nice would it be if you could have creative writing workshops and poetry workshops in people's lunch times in workplaces? I feel like it's something about the groups I work with. I work with young people, and then I work with, I have a group of older people who are sort of over 60 who I work with. And then I work with like prisons, hospitals, probation hostels, that sort of thing. But the bulk of my work is like older people and younger people. And there's something about like being in the bit in between, like being an adult, where you just lose access to that creative art side of life. I think it's often seen as being a luxury or just a bit frilly or silly and a bit of a waste of time. And I guess when you're younger, people think it's really important for you to experience as much as possible. And when you're older, you're retired, you can do as you wish and spend your time how you wish. But when you are in that bit in between, it might be seen as being a bit lazy to indulge in this stuff, which is ridiculous, because, we know that the arts has such a positive impact on people's mental health. And it's interesting, I do occasionally do workshops. So I did, sometimes I'll do kind of corporate work where a business wants me to research like a particular idea with a group of their employees, and we will often explore that through creative writing and poetry. So they write poems, and we use some of the things that they've written poems about as part of the research. And the thing is that people come out of that and they say, gosh, well, I've never really thought about myself in such detail, or it was really nice to just sit and not think about the pressures of my kids or my work for an hour. It has such an impact on people's mental health, which can only be good for business. It can only be, I suppose particularly at the moment, I think it's a worry about all of our mental health, how we're going to get through the next few months. I think that often it is underestimated what a good impact arts and creativity and poetry and writing can have on people.
Yes, Jess, I think that's so powerful. And I totally agree. That whole point about taking people away from their day-to-day, enabling different parts of their mind to work that don't normally get exercised. Like you said, it's seen as a luxury, or it's seen as, oh, poetry is not something I can do. I hated it at school. I'm not going to do it. That's not for me. I'm not creative. We build this rhetoric, don't we, around skills and talent and practice. So if you really want to do it and you've got time to put some hours or minutes in, you will improve. And not everyone wants to be the world's best performance poet. I think writing for pleasure or reading for pleasure or speaking for pleasure, a bit like you'd play a game of charades, is also really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and it's something as well about just, I think it's also about feeling like you have a voice. And even if that is just writing something down and putting it in a notebook and having that notebook in a drawer for the next 10 years, but putting something down in words makes you feel like you have a voice. And I think that's really important. And I think it also helps you to work through things, to process stuff, to order your thoughts, and all of that is really important. And I think it's interesting when people say, oh, well, I can't do it. I'm just no good at it. And I think, well, that really doesn't matter. You could, you're not, like you say, you don't have to be the best performance poet in the world. You're not, a lot of the time, you're not writing, you're not creating because you want to be any good at it. It's just a process which might be enjoyable. I did a workshop I was involved in a really great project in Leicester called After 18, which provides support for refugees and asylum seekers who have reached 18. So a lot of the support they got when they were under 18 has dropped away. And I was doing the creative writing stuff with them. But I stuck around for the art workshops and joined in with the art workshops. And when I was in school, my art teacher used to make me just go and sit out in the corridor because she said, you are no good at this and it's a waste of time giving you the resources to do it. You can't even join in because it's a waste of our resources because you are so bad at it. And it gave me such a complex about like my
that's horrid.
ability to draw. And I joined in this art workshop, and I'm not going to win any prizes for drawing, but just drawing for an hour, which was something I hadn't done for about 15 years, was so enjoyable. And I came home and I was like, look at this picture I've done. And it was terrible, but it was something that I had made. And suddenly I got an insight into actually, perhaps this is how people feel when they come to my workshops. You know, they might produce something that they don't think is going to win any prizes, but they've produced something which is their own talent, and that's great.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. It's not about winning prizes, like you said, but having that mindset. So Jess, while kids are, young people, children, pupils are going to be off school for a sizable amount of time, and the work that you do you want to talk to the listeners about what you're going to be doing, how people can get in contact with you, how you can help support people, and your Patreon page?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, it's really interesting. I mean, I've gone from 3 weeks ago, I was at the point in my career where I was like, things are going really well. I was right in the middle of doing this, being involved in the BBC Writers Academy. I was writing for television, and all of that stuff will happen again, probably in about 3 months' time. But everything's just dropped away because we're all having to go into self-isolation. And I've pretty much lost any ability to pay my bills for the next few months. So what I did is I looked at the skills that I have, and I have put them online, and I've set up this Patreon page and talking about kind of trying things even when you're not very good at them. I really struggle with technology, and I'm really having to practice my resilience skills at not getting frustrated with technology. So I've set up this Patreon page where I'm offering various different things. So I'm offering, there's going to be poems which are going to go up weekly. I'm kind of in the same way that when I was writing about education and I was writing about the division of the Labour Party, I'm currently writing about the political and societal response to this worldwide pandemic. So I'm writing about that, and there are poems going up there every week. They're going up in written form and they're going up in digital form. Some of them going to have music behind them. My husband is in my band and he's putting some music behind some of them as well. And then I run a poetry night in Leicester called Find the Right Words upstairs at the Western, and we are going to be doing that as a podcast. The first episode has already gone up. They'll be going up monthly, and they will have kind of local poets from Leicester. They'll also have two nationally acclaimed headline acts involved in the podcast as well. And then I'm also offering one-to-one mentoring, and that is for any age. I'm doing some with my 8-year-old niece, but I'm also doing some with some of the older members who come to my Thursday morning writing group. So that really is for any age. And then I'm doing some masterclasses where I'm going to put up some pre-recorded creative writing workshops up there as well. And then I'm going to do some group work, like live workshops through Zoom. So there's loads of different stuff which is going up on my Patreon page. And I thought particularly with kids being off school, with us all being stuck in the house and needing to look after our mental health, I thought it'd be a good thing to offer.
Thank you, Jess. And I'll put links in the show notes to your Patreon page, and you can also follow. It's at Jess Green Poet on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And finally, Jess, before we finish, did you want to share a poem with us?
Oh, I could definitely share a poem. One of my own poems?
Yes, I think so.
Oh, yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Can you give me a minute to find something?
Yeah, of course I can. Yeah, of course I can.
Right, I will read you this. So I wrote this shortly after the general election, but I feel like it becomes ever more relevant. So I'll read you this, and it's called Reasons to be Cheerful. Plastic in oceans has reduced. Deforestation is slowing. Fewer animals are being eaten. Global terror attacks have fallen. The otter has made a comeback from near extinction. The sound of my husband's keys in the door. The train pulling into Leicester Station. The train pulling into St Pancras. My friends in the pub. My friends at the end of the phone. My blind, toothless, incontinent dog. Always. Anyone's dog. Always. My Thursday morning poetry group. The end of a run. Cheese. Red wine, undeserved hangover-free Saturday mornings, birds on the feeder, unexpected parcels in the post, writing a poem for the first time in 18 months. All it took was a Tory landslide. Poems written by kids who tell you they can't write poetry. Poems written by angry men who tell you they hate poetry. Guilt-free days off. Guilt-free anything. Working from home. Not working at home. The end of a show with no mistakes, a rowdy audience, a pub theatre, board games with few instructions, new notebooks, nice pens, massive dinners, flowers, tea lights, roaring fires, good pubs after long walks, unanticipated lefties. Seagulls by the sea, where they are meant to be, and not in my back garden in the Midlands. Bed socks, gogglebox. Friday nights, Sunday sushi discounts at Little Tokyo, weeknight trips to the cinema, vegan tiffin and colossal mugs of tea. People who have no idea how good they are. People quietly making brilliant art. People who do not believe in the phrase guilty pleasure. EastEnders. Ben Mitchell from EastEnders. Kindness. Kindness that asks for nothing back. Kindness when it is inconvenient. Kindness in the middle of the night when there are no clear solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess, for sharing that beautiful poem with us, your time, your inspiration, your deep thoughts, and I will absolutely share things, and people, please get in touch. I know a lot of parents, you're feeling overwhelmed by having your children with you for potentially a really long time. I appreciate that. So please, people like Jess are here, support her to help, enable her to support your children and their learning, and also yourself and your creativity. And thank you so much. We're so, so grateful, Jess.
Thank you very much.
Take care, and we'll see you in the next episode, everyone. Bye. Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.